Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. I'm Dan Belmont with goodwinegoodpeople.com. Welcome to our Meet the Maker webinar. So you know this is being recorded, but you are not on camera. Only myself and my wonderful guest is being recorded this evening. If you do want to participate, we'd love to hear from you. Please jump into the Q&A box with any questions that you have for our guest winemaker this evening. I am joined by none other than Mr. Angelo Van Dyk, winemaker for Yo El Rey Wines. Angelo and I have been friends now for a better part of a decade, and we met working together at Bedales of Borough, a trio of London-based wine bars in London's historic markets. It was about 2018, I believe. Angelo said, I'm going to just leave my job for a couple months and I'm going to go down to South Africa and make some wine. And I thought that was so cool. I followed him down. And so I got to see a bit of the 2018 harvest, but just the tail end. I showed up just in time for all the work to be done, just so I could taste the fruits of his labor.
It's all the good stuff. Great timing, my man.
And what a joy it was. And so since then, Angelo is now on to his fourth harvest. And here to tell you all about it is Mr. Angelo Van Dyk himself. How you doing, buddy?
Good to be here, my man. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's our pleasure, always. So you have so far have 4 harvests under your belt. That's super exciting.
Very exciting. Yeah, vintage 18, as I said, was the first one. And
what did you produce that year?
So that was the first year we did it. 2018 was a single wine, which was made from Syrah and Grenache. I guess at the time it was a bit of a sort of, not a roll of the dice, but more a test the water, kind of see what the whole experience of going back would be like, what making wine would be like, sort of, you know, trying to plug into harvest for the months of February, March, and a little bit of April, and getting it to a point where I could leave it and step away and then come back to London. So there was just the one single cuvee in 18, and I suppose it's kind of gone through a little bit of an evolution since then. But yeah, fourth harvest this year. Obviously, I missed last year's harvest because of COVID restrictions, which were kind of ongoing. But yeah, four under the belt, which feels good.
Good, mate. And so you went back. When does harvest typically start in South Africa? When do people typically start picking grapes?
So obviously, depending on where you are in the Cape, I would say a sort of a broad stretch of harvest would be anywhere from kind of late Jan, early February for the early ripening varieties, and then a little bit later into April. I mean, there are some regions that'll pick late April, early May. I mean,
oh, wow.
Yeah. So, you know, somewhere like the Hemel and Ardor, which is where I was based this year, there's a fantastic producer called Restless River that do a cool climate Cabernet. So you've got a cooler climate and a late ripening variety, and they will pick sort of late April, May already. It's pretty crazy. But yeah, you know, obviously Southern Hemisphere, you're the opposite to what's happening in the Northern. So yeah.
So 2018 you did the Grenache Syrah. 2019 you went back, you made more, right? Yeah, 2020 introduced a new wine. You made the Grenache Gris with some skin contact, beautiful rosé wine. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And then took off 2020, came back for 2020. Cooked off 2021, right. Came back 2022. And what's in the works for this year?
So this year was a year with a lot of change on the cards. It was a year where I moved production facilities away from Stellenbosch to the Hemel and Ardor, which is close to a little seaside town called Hermanus. And it was the first year where there was a lot of the heavy lifting that now kind of landed on my plate and less sort of piggybacking off fruit of other people. And so, yeah, I guess there was a lot more grunt work. This year we've managed to pick up 3 different varieties to make 3 single wines. So there aren't going to be any red blends in the 2022 vintage. There is a rosé, which is made from Syrah. It's all direct press. And so there is a little kind of touch of blush to it, which I think will slowly kind of fall out as it ages in barrel. But you have a Syrah rosé, you have a Muscat. First time I'm working with Muscat that I picked and fermented on the skins. So that's going to be a little bit of a kind of an orangey, skinsy version,
Cool.
which is quite exciting. And then a Grenache again, but that is going to be the red component to the range this year. But it is just a single variety Grenache. And actually, weirdly, from the original vineyard where I first picked Grenache from, so vintage 18 and 19, was this same Grenache fruit that I'm now using in 2022, because 2020's Grenache was from a different vineyard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Now, is it really access to fruit that is driving these cuvées? I'm sure that has obviously something to do with it. But, did you set out saying, I want to work with Muscat this year?
So, yeah, I think, you kind of start out with an idea of what you want to make, and then it is definitely access to fruits. I think there are many ways you can make wine, and I'm sure there's a lot of winemakers and producers that see what I do as a bit of a kind of, a hack, if you will, but in the sense that I don't actually necessarily have the luxury or the privilege of being able to own vineyard land, farm grapes, and actually work with a single vineyard year on year. And so I am kind of beholden to what is available from grape farmers and what's on the market for sale. The big thing for me this year was actually being able to go back and start to establish relationships that year on year starts to provide an opportunity to get momentum and to work with those same vineyards again. I don't think it's necessarily a make or break. I think if there are new cuvées that are added, if there's, amazing fruit that comes available, then, why not work with it? But I think there is something, I don't know. I think there is something that adds to a brand when you get to know a vineyard, you get to understand the complexities of it, the small little, eccentricities of it too. I mean, a wine is very much alive in the cellar and in that vineyard, and so year on year you start to get a better idea of what Mother Nature's giving you ultimately when you do kind of work with those same plots with a bit more consistency.
In case you're curious, I have the 2019 Yo El Rey Grenache Syrah blend, and it is drinking beautifully right now. Really nice, kind of dark, deep notes, bit of that licorice almost, and like black licorice, really cool. Really nice herbaceous notes, and we opened it probably a little over an hour now, and so it's really just starting. The floral notes are coming out. The nose is really waking up. Beautiful fruit. And then we were just talking yesterday, and you said you get to revisit the 2018 vintage recently, yeah?
Yeah, so it was really sweet. There were friends of ours who got married recently, and the bride's mother has collected Yo El Rey over the years, and so we actually got to taste 18, 19, and 20, which is unlabeled in bottle. But I managed to get my hands on some of it and send it across to Durban. And I mean, it was actually a really beautiful thing to kind of taste them all side by side and sort of see those little things that are developing and taking shape. And the 18 is actually standing up really nicely. I mean, that's going on 4 years now. And you are starting to get a little touch of the development kicking in, but yeah, I'm really proud of it. It's looking really good.
And so you really don't know what you're going to get though when you open a bottle down the line. Are you crafting a wine with time in mind?
It's a good question. I think honestly, for me, and given the nature of the way I'm making it, getting the wine to market sooner rather than later plays in my favor, at least purely from like a business perspective. I think if I had the luxury of time, then perhaps, yes, I might be kind of making wine with, a little bit more of an intent to have the ageability element to it. But in all honesty, I think like for me, I want to make wines that I would like to drink, because I think you can craft wines according to a recipe or a market and sort of, plug something in there. But yeah, I think for me, drinkability for me is key. And I think if you have to sit on a wine for 10 years before you can drink it, I mean, there is a beauty in that for sure. Don't get me wrong. But no, I think generally speaking, the wines that I make tend to be more approachable in their youth. And I guess that's also ultimately a product of a vintage, of a harvest. The fruit that I've got has definitely been better suited to a more kind of vibrant style. I guess you could argue like, you could go for a bigger extraction of color, more tannin. You could pick later and get, a higher alcohol, and all of these things would play into a kind of preservative ultimately. But yeah,
And how would you describe your winemaking style? I would say light touch, in terms of process. Do you want to kind of take people through kind of each wine this harvest?
Yeah, sure. So I guess, we can kind of go through the order that they came in. So we started with Syrah this year, and the Syrah was picked from a new block in Stanford. So it's a little bit further along the coast from Hermanus, but very kind of close vicinity to the ocean, very kind of sandy soils where that Syrah was grown. And basically everything was picked by hand into small little lug boxes, and all of that came back across to the cellar, where we were lucky enough that, basically it's a 1 ton press, pneumatic press. And we picked just over a ton. It was about 1.2 tons of Syrah. And we managed to get all of that in a whole bunch. So one single press cycle that it ran through. We basically just did a direct press on it. And, I think for people listening, you can either go with a whole bunch press or a destemmed version of it. When you whole bunch press something, you end up with much cleaner juice ultimately. The juice runs off almost kind of, if you imagine all of those little stems and twigs forming like a lattice. And a natural filter almost, and the juice ultimately does come off a lot cleaner, and it kind of anticipating making a really light, delicate touch of a Syrah kind of rosé. I'm not actually sure, what bracket it'll fall into. I think it will be more rosé than light red, but it actually did have a bit of color to it. But yeah, so basically there was whole bunch press. The juice was pumped out into a little kind of tank to settle overnight. And then the juice was racked, basically taken out of that tank and put into old oak barrels. And Bob's your uncle basically barreled down. We did add sulfur at pressing. So we added a small little dose of sulfur. But that was the rosé, pretty light touch. That's now in barrel and ticking along. I think it's pretty much gone through malolactic fermentation now. So
nice. Yeah. Your Grenache Gris also spent time in barrel?
Correct, exactly. So yeah, the Grenache Gris in 20, that was all destemmed. So everything was destemmed there and fermented on the skins, pressed to old oak, and that spent about 7-8 months in old oak. So
the texture on that wine is a thing of wonder, really. Love it.
It's pretty, and I think like it's got a little bit of booze on it. Like it's sitting at a good 14%, but I think it's quite a serious kind of food style of skin contact. It definitely plays well with cuisine. So
what came in next?
And then next we jumped onto some Muscat. So the Muscat was inspired by at Newcomer. I work with a producer called Domaine Matassa. His name's Tom Lubber, and is originally from South Africa, but is now making wine in the Roussillon in France. And he works a lot with Muscat, and his wines are absolutely stunning and really kind of ethereal. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Muscat grown in South Africa. Usually they use it to make fortified wines or to make sweet dessert wines. They call it Hanepoort in South Africa, actually. Huh. So I picked some Hanepoort from a vineyard in the Bredekloof, which is a really beautiful part of the Cape, probably about, I guess, an hour and a half's drive from Cape Town, but inland this time, up towards Ceres. And yeah, a really, really stunning part of the Cape. So we picked about 2 tons of that. And that Muscat was totally destemmed. So everything came off the stems and was fermented in a big plastic fermenter, which holds about 1.5 tons, and then a smaller one. And that was fermented on the skins, going through the destemming process. It then kind of goes through a crusher. So you do end up with quite a lot of free juice. So you don't necessarily need a foot crusher to release, essentially juice for the yeast to attack it. But yeah, so that was fermented in plastic, a little bit of sulfur added then, and then pressed off to old oak once again. At this point, there is a barrel that's probably about a half, 3/4 full, and playing with the idea of letting a bit of floor develop on it, which is a little bit of a gamble and a bit of an experiment, but I think it might potentially work well with the kind of the skinsy style. It's got a little bit more structure and protection from the skin fermentation. So yeah, it could be a bit of a trippy wine with some floor added to it. But
take 30 seconds, just describe the floor process and what might hopefully come out of that, by doing it that way in terms of flavor.
So I guess floor is probably best known for its use in sherry. I believe it's the Fino style that typically has floor to it. But essentially, when you put wine in barrel, you generally will tend to what they call top up, because as wine ferments and then settles, either through absorption into the barrel or evaporation, you start to lose a little bit of wine. And so you end up with what they call a head between the wine and the top of the barrel. And that then, exposes the wine to oxygen, essentially. And it can be a good thing or a bad thing, because you can also then run the risk of other bacteria attacking it. But in instances like in Spain, for example, where they make Fino sherry, they'll actually allow that head to drop down quite low, and then this very thin layer of what they call floor develops. And
it's a yeast, yeah?
It is a yeast, I believe. Yeah, I always struggle to remember if it's definitely not a bacteria. I think it is a yeast. Yeah, you're right. And it essentially adds like a really beautiful kind of saltiness to the wine. It does also kind of have a little yeasty touch. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but yeah, I guess a sort of another dimension to a white wine that would otherwise not necessarily be there. And I don't think it always works, but actually I've tasted some really beautiful Chenin Blanc from South Africa that's had floor, a part of that aging process. And so, yeah, it should be quite interesting on the Muscat.
Awesome. And then, so you brought in some Grenache.
And then the Grenache. So the Grenache is going to be the red wine this year. That was picked from the original block, like I mentioned, in Bot River. Bot River tends to get pretty darn hot during the harvest months. So you're obviously dealing with a grape like Grenache, which does accumulate sugars, can end up with quite high ABVs. But yeah, this was a really stunning block that I think, for me, both emotionally, like when you're there, it is a really kind of, I don't know, it's a beautiful place that kind of, yeah, without sounding too woo-woo, like it kind of speaks to you in a way. But yeah, we picked just over 3 tons for the Grenache Noir. So that is going to be the biggest chunk of production this year. And that wine was all destemmed and put into, again, same very basic production process. So all destemmed, all into plastic fermenters, fermented away, but fermented right through on the skin. So until it was dry and the caps or the skins at the top actually collapsed into the wine, then pressed off and gone across to again, old oak barrels. And everything this year is an oak, purely from a pragmatic, angle. Like it is just actually a lot cheaper to buy old oak barrels than it would be to invest in something like, a stainless steel tank or, a concrete egg,
Yep.
Maybe, if I think in an ideal world, sure, I'd be working with concrete. Absolutely. I love the vessel. I love what it adds to wines, but actually, when you're starting out and you don't have big money behind you or investors and you're bootstrapping it a bit, then you kind of, you work with what you got. And barrels can actually be bought pretty cheap, secondhand, if they've been used 3 or 4 times by the big wineries who need the oak influence in their wines that they're not going to get from these old barrels. That suits me just fine. Like I would prefer a more neutral vessel than something that's going to pump vanilla into it. Like for me, that's kind of perfect. So, yeah.
So we had a question come in. How large is the vineyard in like hectares or acres that can produce 3 tons of grapes?
That is a great question. I mean, so let's say, for example, I'm picking this Grenache. That is part of a massive vineyard space. Like I reckon that Grenache vineyard is probably about, I don't know, 5 hectares, maybe 8. So it's a really big space.
Yeah.
And I'm picking 3 tons from a handful of rows.
Okay.
It's
bunches per vine. Let's look a little more micro.
Bunches per vine. I mean, people always kind of say like, okay, again, this is like such a generalization, but like one vine is almost kind of going to give you 1 bottle, like in a way. 3 tons of fruit is going to give me roughly 3,000 bottles of wine.
Okay.
As a general rule of thumb.
How big's your picking crew?
So again, it depends. I think this is another big topic to explore, but labor is always, a factor in production in South Africa, and there's a lot of people that misuse it. But the reality is that labor is cheap. And so, picking teams depending on the facilities will be large. I mean, when we picked the Syrah, there was probably a team of maybe 10 people, which is not that big. But the crew that picked the Grenache, I think there was close to 25,
wow.
maybe 30.
And so you're cranking that out pretty quick then.
I mean, it's unbelievable. Like when it gets moving, it's incredible. What was quite interesting is when we went to pick the Muscat, they were working on a system where basically like they carry a little kind of, imagine like a time tag. And so every case that they physically picked and brought along, they would then get stamped. And I don't know how the sort of the payment then worked on top of that, but basically, it adds, they get paid more for the more grapes that they bring in. So essentially, yeah.
Cool. I think labor is a good kind of transition to this question. We are good wine, good people. And so I wanted to give you the opportunity to just give any shout outs to good people that have helped you in this process with this harvest or with Yo El Rey at large. And then we'll see if we've got any more time.
No, for sure. I mean, I think certainly to consider this year, it would be impossible not to recognize Alex McFarlane. Who is a winemaker in South Africa, is also a very good friend of mine. Because, I guess ultimately one has to recognize the fact that I'm in South Africa for, a few months of the year to make wine, but there's a big chunk of stuff that needs to happen between picking and fermenting and actually then getting that thing into bottle and onto somebody's table. So Yeah, Alex is a winemaker who has just started out in South Africa. Her wines are very inspiring, and she is super, super talented, and I think a bright star in the future. But she is now my eyes and ears on the ground when I'm not there, and kind of sending updates of how things are ticking along, and essentially, asking me, do I want this to happen? When do I want that to happen? Blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, Alex and her husband Wayne are based out of the Himalaya Valley, so they're on the ground, and for sure, yeah, without her, this harvest would not have happened. So a big shout out to her for this year. Yeah,
awesome. And you're bringing in some of her wines up over here to the UK, yeah?
Indeed, yeah. So we've got one of her cuvées at the moment. It's called the Monday's Child. It's a Chenin Blanc, which is really, really impressive. It is quite a sort of an opulent style of Chenin, a lot of freshness in the wine, but yeah, I mean, it certainly punches above its weight. Really, really beautiful, elegant wine. So yeah, that's kicking about in the Yo El Rey bottle shop. Mm-hmm. If anyone wants to support that producer, your money is well spent there for sure.
Very good. And we do have a couple more minutes. So we kind of talked on this a little bit earlier in the beginning, but we got another question, is there a time limit to complete harvest? Generally, we said that depending on your grape, you're really looking at ripeness. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And I think, one of the big skills when it comes to winemaking is knowing when to pick, because you're looking at a grape ripening and accumulating sugar, and at the same time it's losing acidity, and you kind of are looking for a balance where you have acidity for freshness in the wine, and you still have enough sugar so that ultimately you can ferment this grape to a certain point of alcohol. And so, yeah, you are driven by the ripening kind of cycle of these grapes. Some of them ripen earlier than others. And so ultimately, yeah, you kind of tasting, analyzing sugars, looking to see, okay, now's the right time. I'm going to pull this off the vine and get it processed. So yeah, I guess time limit, perhaps you're kind of, you're playing to what Mother Nature is giving you.
Another great one. Well, I think we'll probably wrap up on this one, but in terms of blending wine, and I know you're not blending anything from this harvest, but in previous years you have done the Grenache Syrah. At what point in the process do you do that? And since you have, this wine, this Grenache Syrah that was made 3 times over, how do you see the wines from this harvest kind of tipping the cap to the previous vintages? Are you looking to do something completely different? You kind of build up a following on a wine, and what do you hope for the new ones?
Yeah. So, so to answer the first question, so about the blending, I think this is, winemaker preference. You can blend right at the start. You can co-ferment these grapes together and ultimately end up with a Grenache Syrah co-ferment where all the juices together, all the grapes are together, and you then go to barrel with it as just one big, massive blend. Or ultimately, you can process these individual grape varieties on their own and blend right at the end when you kind of, maybe look at it in a more, not scientific sense, but, you can literally measure out like, okay, this is going to be 60% of that and 40% of this. It is preference. I think each has its pros and cons. I think when you're working with them as individual varieties, you've got a bit more control, as opposed to something that is just kind of blended together at the start and then aged like that. However, you probably have a little bit more of a kind of an interesting wine, maybe, if you kind of blend everything together at the start. Maybe that's controversial. I don't know. I have always blended at the end, so everything has aged as a single barrel of Syrah or a single barrel of Grenache, and then at the end we've brought them together in the past. And then
at that point, what your components are, and you could really have a good think on it. I mean, you're not going to dump wine down the drain, but that balance is important. Yeah.
Exactly, because if you kind of taste it and you think, okay, wow, the Syrah is like really shining this year, whilst the Grenache is, you know, maybe a little bit shy, but it's adding a nice red fruit character. Okay, I'm going to blend it accordingly so that, you know, I end up with X that goes to bottle. Yeah, and then I suppose, you know, what is this year kind of looking towards, and what is it tipping the cap to? I think this year, stylistically, I think you will see quite a change. I think it's going to be a little more kind of hands off. I don't think I'm necessarily confident enough to kind of go the zero sulfur, zero topping up, totally natural. Like I don't think I am that kind of winemaker, or necessarily want to sort of roll the dice and risk anything. But for sure, I think there's a little bit more kind of hands off, allowing, you know, Mother Nature to take its course and let the wine kind of reveal itself. And yeah, I think it's fortuitous that I ended up working with this Grenache again. So that is a nice little, you know, nod back to the first few vintages. But I'm really excited about it. And I think, you know, again, another one of our producers at Newcomer, he was saying, his name is Klaus Preisinger.
Yeah.
I was chatting to him, and he was saying how when he started making wine, he made wine very much according to what he had learned in a theoretical academic sense. And so it was all textbook, and slowly you learn to kind of let go of the reins and just allow things to take shape on their own. And something that stuck with me was, you know, he said at the start, perhaps you might lose 2 or 3 followers, people that love your wines, and because the style changes, you might lose those. But ultimately, you'll probably end up gaining 5 or 6, you know.
Yeah.
And it was something that stuck with me to kind of like, you know, you can, or you could give the people what they want, which, you know, I don't think you should necessarily turn around to supporters and say, you know, move on. But I do think that, like, you know, if you have real conviction in what you want to achieve in your projects, you should stand by that. And yeah, I mean, ultimately people will drink wine, and that's the beauty of it, right? Like if we all drank the same thing, it would be a pretty boring world out there. So
absolutely. Listen, we're going to touch over time, and I could listen to you talk all day long. We did get one question come through on Instagram earlier, and I just want to touch on it, and it's a tough one. What's next?
What's next? Yeah, good question. I think Yo El Rey is getting to a point where you know, it's growing. Production this year increased by you know, a good almost 3,000 bottles. There is a lot more wine being produced, and I think for me the next big step is looking for another market. So at the moment the wines are sold in South Africa and in the UK. There has been a little bit of interest in Canada and in Singapore. And I think that is certainly sort of the next sites would be getting a footprint in another country. But yeah, I think, you know, I do definitely want to keep growing it. It's something I'm really excited about and passionate about, and I've thrown a lot of time and energy into it. So there are often days, as cliche as it sounds, like there's often mornings where I wake up and I'm like, I'm done. Like, it's not worth the stress. It's not worth the time and the money and the back and forth and the late nights and sleepless mornings. But then, you know, you end up getting a listing on a Michelin starred list somewhere, and it really does kind of warm your heart and your soul to imagine people drinking it around a table somewhere special, and I guess that's kind of the joy in it ultimately. Yeah.
All right, last one, rapid fire. If you could get your hands on any fruit worldwide, one more grape, what would it be?
Wow. Rapid fire. Oof. Okay. Possibly I think I would possibly try and work with a little bit of Weissburgunder, which I know is Pinot Blanc and is Pinot Bianco in Northern Italy. But yeah, I mean, Weissburgunder for me feels like a grape variety that has a lot of potential in in a kind of a German context, at least. Like some of these wines I've been tasting recently from that grape variety are super cool, really, really elegant stuff. And I think that would be interesting.
Cool, man. Couldn't agree more. Angelo, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Good Wine, Good People has the 2019 Grenache Syrah and the 2020 Grenache Gris on our website, and they are on sale. Best price you can get in the UK, and I'm going to leave them that way through the end of the month. And so I hope you guys snag a bottle of it while you still can, because it's going to go, and then we're going to have to wait for the next one. When is 2020 Grenache Syrah gonna land?
So is bottled in South Africa, will be labeled and boxed up and shipped, I think realistically probably the tail end of summer. I reckon, call it the autumn. Yeah.
Awesome. We can't wait. Angelo, thank you so very much. We're going to put this chat up on the website for people to see. It's also streaming live on YouTube. You can visit it on the channel there, and so we'll get a little more traction out of it. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time for another Meet the Maker with Good Wine, Good People. Cheers.
Thanks,
bud.